A stranger bursts into a bustling cafe, pointing an accusatory finger at Barron Trump. What follows is an exchange so unexpected, it leaves everyone questioning their assumptions. It was a breezy afternoon in the heart of Philadelphia. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, mingling with the warm chatter and the clinking of cups inside a cozy corner cafe. At a small table near the window, Barron Trump sat, his tall frame hunched over a thick book. Dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, he blended into the crowd, or so he thought. Seeking only a moment of peace away from the relentless public scrutiny of being the youngest son of a former president, he felt a rare sense of anonymity among the patrons scrolling through their phones and sipping lattes. Barron was engrossed in his book when a sharp voice cut through the hum of the cafe. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" The cafe fell silent. Heads turned toward a man standing a few feet from Barron's table. He appeared to be in his late 40s, with a weathered face and fiery eyes. His clothes, though not ragged, bore the signs of hard times. His confrontational tone and tense postures set the room on edge. For a moment, Barron froze, not from fear, but surprise. This wasn't what he'd envisioned for his quiet afternoon. The tension in the room thickened as the man continued, his voice trembling with anger. "You've had everything handed to you on a silver platter. Do you even know what it's like to struggle?" Uneasy glances were exchanged among the patrons. The barista hesitated, her hand hovering near the phone. Barron, however, remained calm. Closing his book and setting it gently on the table, he looked up. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice steady, "I don't know what's upset you, but maybe we could talk about it." The man scoffed. "Talk? What could you possibly have to say that someone like me would want to hear?" The cafe grew even quieter. All eyes were on them. Then, instead of reacting with anger, Barron did something no one expected. He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but attentive, and gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Please, sit," he said, his tone calm and inviting. The man hesitated, clearly taken aback. His fists remained clenched, his glare unwavering. "Why would I sit with someone like you? You're just another spoiled kid who'll never understand the real world," the man sneered. Barron's response was measured. "Maybe you're right," he said. "I haven't lived your life. But if you sit down, maybe you could tell me about it." The man faltered for a moment. Barron's words weren't a challenge, they were an invitation. Yet, he leaned in closer, his voice sharp with sarcasm. "You think I owe you my story? That it'll make you feel better about yourself?" Barron didn't flinch. "I think everyone's story deserves to be heard," he said softly, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. The man stood there, torn between his anger and an unexpected civility he wasn't prepared for. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he grabbed the empty chair and dragged it noisily across the floor. Sitting down, he crossed his arms defensively, his eyes scanning Barron for any sign of pretense. "Fine," he muttered. "You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you." The cafe's atmosphere shifted. The tension didn't disappear, but it became something less hostile. The barista relaxed, lowering her hand from the phone. The patrons leaned in subtly, their curiosity piqued. Barron nodded and leaned forward slightly. "I'm listening," he said simply. And then, the man began to speak. What he shared wasn't just a story, it was a revelation. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, but the raw emotion remained. "You see me and think I'm just angry for no reason," he began, his tone heavy with bitterness. "But you don't know what it's like to lose everything." His eyes swept across the cafe, daring anyone to interrupt, before settling back on Barron. "I had a job, a family, a decent life. Then the factory I worked at shut down, just like that, gone. Hundreds of us left with nothing but empty promises. They said they'd relocate us, but that never happened." The cafe remained still, the only sound the faint hiss of the espresso machine. The man's voice cracked as he continued, his tough exterior faltering with every word. "I tried to hold it together for my wife and kids. worked whatever odd jobs I could find. But when you're barely scraping by, it doesn't take much to break you." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. "My wife left, took the kids with her. Said she couldn't live like this anymore." He hesitated, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can't even blame her." Barron sat in silence, his expression unreadable, though his eyes radiated empathy. The man's fingers traced the wood grain of the table absently, as if seeking some sort of grounding. "Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and feel everyone's eyes on you? Judging you? Thinking you're nothing?" His voice cracked again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "That's my life now, every single day." The patrons listening shifted uncomfortably. A woman at a nearby table stared into her coffee cup, avoiding the raw truth spilling out. "And then I see someone like you," the man continued, his voice rising slightly. "Sitting there in your nice clothes, reading a book, like you don't have a care in the world. And it makes me mad because no matter what I do, I'll never have what you have." The words landed heavily, not just on Barron, but on everyone within earshot. Barron didn't rush to respond, allowing the man's pain to settle into the room. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes," he said softly. "But I do know what it feels like to be judged, to have people decide who you are before you've even had a chance to say a word." The man's head shot up, his eyes narrowing in skepticism. "What could you possibly know about that?" he demanded. Barron's reply wasn't what anyone expected. It shifted the tone of the conversation and the mood of the entire cafe. Barron met the man's glare with steady eyes. "You might think I've had it easy because of my name. And in some ways, you're right. I've never had to worry about a roof over my head or food on the table. But that doesn't mean I don't understand what it feels like to be misunderstood." The man scoffed, ready to interject, but Barron held up a hand, not dismissively, but as a gesture to let him finish. "Everywhere I go, people make assumptions about me," Barron continued, his tone calm yet firm. "They think they know who I am, what I believe, and what I've done, just because of my last name. They don't see me as a person. They see a caricature, someone they can project their frustrations onto. Kind of like what's happening right now." The man's posture shifted slightly, his defensive stance loosening. "I'm not saying my struggles are the same as yours," Barron said, his voice genuine. "They're not. But pain is pain. Feeling invisible, feeling like no one understands you, that's something we all face, no matter where we come from." The cafe was now utterly silent. Even the barista had stopped mid-step, her tray of cups momentarily forgotten. Barron leaned back slightly, giving the man space to absorb his words. "I'm not here to argue with you or even change your mind. I just want to understand. Because I think we're all carrying things no one else sees. And maybe, just maybe, we'd be a little kinder to each other if we did." The man's jaw tightened as if he might lash out again, but instead, he exhaled sharply, releasing some of the weight he carried. "You really believe that?" he asked, his voice quieter, almost uncertain. Barron nodded. "I do. And I think, deep down, you do too. Otherwise, you wouldn't have shared your story." The man blinked, his hardened exterior cracking ever so slightly. He rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes flickering around the cafe as if searching for something, or someone, to anchor him. The man's eyes swept the room, noticing for the first time how many people were watching. A flicker of self-consciousness crossed his face, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he turned back to Barron. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, his tone softer now, almost reflective. The cafe was steeped in silence, each patron caught in the unspoken tension of the moment. The man sat back, his posture shifting from defensive to contemplative, as though weighing his next words. Finally, he broke the silence. "I walked in here mad," he said, shaking his head. "Mad at the world, mad at people like you, who I thought had it all handed to them. But maybe I've been holding onto that anger for too long." Barron stayed silent, giving the man space to process his thoughts. "It's not about you," the man admitted quietly. It never was. Barron finally spoke, his voice steady but calm. I think it's easy to blame people we don't know. It's harder to face what's really hurting us. But you did that today, and that takes courage. The man looked up at Barron, his expression softening. But then, his gaze darted toward the window, and something in his demeanor shifted. A nervous energy crept in as he glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the door. You're a good kid, he said abruptly, almost as if trying to end the conversation before it went further. He stood, smoothing his shirt with shaky hands. I've got to go. The cafe watched as the man turned to leave. But instead of heading for the exit, he walked to the barista, leaned in, and said something that made her eyes widen in shock. She nodded hesitantly and handed him a small slip of paper. Without looking back, the man pocketed it and hurried out the door. The cafe's patrons exchanged puzzled glances. A woman whispered to her companion, "What was that about?" Barron, still seated, furrowed his brow. Something about the man's sudden departure didn't sit right with him. He stood, walking over to the counter. "What did he say to you?" Barron asked the barista, his voice low. The barista hesitated, looking conflicted. Finally, she leaned in and whispered, "He asked if we had security cameras. Said he wanted to know if they were working." Barron's stomach sank. He turned toward the door, his mind racing. Before he could decide what to do, the faint sound of sirens cut through the air, growing louder with each passing second. The cafe's patrons froze, their earlier camaraderie replaced by a palpable unease. Barron moved to the window, peering outside just in time to see police cars screeching to a halt at the intersection. Officers jumped out, shouting commands. And there he was, the man from the cafe, standing in the middle of the street. His hands were raised, but something glinted in his grasp. The cafe erupted in gasps as the man shouted something inaudible, his voice carried away by the chaos outside. A tense standoff unfolded as officers tried to de-escalate the situation. Barron watched in stunned silence, the weight of the man's earlier words crashing over him. The anger, the despair, it had all been leading to this. A single, deafening crack echoed through the air. The cafe fell into a stunned hush, the sound reverberating in their chests. Barron stepped back from the window, his face pale. The room buzzed with murmurs, patrons grappling with what they had just witnessed. This wasn't a story of redemption, nor of connection. It was a stark reminder of the silent battles people carry, the cracks that sometimes go unnoticed until it's too late. The cafe's warmth felt distant now, replaced by a chilling awareness. Strangers who had briefly shared a moment of unity were left with questions that had no easy answers. And Barron, clutching his book, walked out into the evening, the weight of what had unfolded pressing heavily on his shoulders.